The hospital smell still clung to my clothes when Marcus told me to pack my bags, 3 days after we buried his father. 3 days after I held his hand through every sob, every family photo slideshow, every condolence call that made him crumble like wet paper. Now he stood in our kitchen, cold as January rain, telling me I had 24 hours to get out of the house we'd called home for 7 years. $450 million. That's what his father left him. 450 million reasons for my husband to suddenly discover he'd never really loved me. The funeral had been a gray blur of expensive suits and crocodile tears. Richard Blackwood had built an empire from nothing, clawed his way from poverty to penthouse suites, and died clutching secrets tighter than his last breath. I'd watched Marcus receive condolences like a king accepting tributes, his grief genuine but already being measured against dollar signs by vultures in Armani. The reading of the will happened in Richard's lawyer's office, all mahogany and leather that smelled like old money. I sat beside Marcus, my hand in his, thinking we were about to start a new chapter of our lives together. Maybe travel, maybe finally have the children we'd been putting off. Maybe just breathe without checking our bank account first. Thomas Hartwell, the family attorney for 30 years, cleared his throat and began reading in that practiced monotone lawyers use to deliver life-changing news. The usual formalities. Small bequests to charities. Then, the bomb. To my son Marcus, I leave the entirety of my business holdings, properties, and liquid assets, totaling approximately $450 million. The room went silent except for the grandfather clock ticking in the corner like a countdown to something inevitable. Marcus squeezed my hand so hard I thought he might break my fingers. I squeezed back, sharing his shock, his overwhelming grief mixed with this impossible windfall. But then I noticed something. A hesitation in Hartwell's voice, his eyes flicking between the will and Marcus with something that looked almost like pity. There was more. However, Hartwell continued, and that single word dropped like a stone into still water, these assets come with specific conditions that must be fulfilled within 30 days of this reading. Marcus leaned forward, his grip on my hand loosened. The primary condition states that Marcus must be unmarried to claim this inheritance. Any current marriage must be dissolved before the 30-day period expires, or the entire estate will be donated to charity. The world stopped. I felt Marcus's hand slip away from mine like he was already practicing letting go. The grandfather clock kept ticking, marking seconds that suddenly felt precious and finite. That night, Marcus paced our bedroom like a caged animal, running calculations I wasn't part of. I watched him from our bed, still wearing the black dress from the will reading, feeling like I was already becoming a ghost in my own home. "It's just money," I whispered into the darkness between us. He stopped pacing, turned to look at me with eyes I didn't recognize. "Just money? Laura, this is generational wealth. This is never having to worry about anything ever again. This is freedom." "What about us? What about the freedom we already have?" But I already knew the answer by the way he looked away, by the way he said nothing at all. The next morning I woke up alone. Marcus was already downstairs, drinking coffee and reading something on his phone with the focused intensity of a man making war plans. "I've been thinking," he said without looking up. Those 4 words, they hit like a physical blow because I knew what was coming, had felt it building through the night like a storm gathering strength. "This doesn't have to be permanent." His voice was careful, measured. "We could get divorced, I claim the inheritance, then maybe in a year or 2 we could remarry. Think of it as a business arrangement." A business arrangement. 7 years of marriage, 7 years of building a life together, supporting each other through his father's disapproval, my mother's cancer, the miscarriage that nearly broke us both. Reduced to a business arrangement. "And if I say no?" I asked, though I already knew. "Then we lose everything, and we'll resent each other for the rest of our lives." The truth was, Marcus had already made his choice. I could see it in the way he'd moved his coffee cup to the far side of the table, creating distance. In the way he kept checking his phone like he was expecting important calls from his new life. In the way he couldn't meet my eyes when he said business arrangement like those words didn't taste like poison. So I said yes, because what else could I say? That love was worth more than financial security? That our marriage vows meant something beyond a prenup? Those were beautiful thoughts. But Marcus had already shown me where he stood. The divorce papers were drawn up with brutal efficiency. Marcus had already called his lawyer before our conversation ended. Turns out you can dissolve a life pretty quickly when enough money is involved. I signed my name on line after line, each signature feeling like I was erasing myself. Marcus signed his with the steady hand of a man who'd found his purpose. The house would be his, obviously. Part of the estate now. I had savings, enough for a small apartment, and a few months to figure out what my life looked like without him in it. 24 hours later, I was loading boxes into my car while Marcus supervised from the front steps like a landlord watching a tenant finally vacate. He'd offered to hire movers, but I wanted to carry my own things, wanted to feel the weight of what I was leaving behind. "This isn't how I wanted things to go," he said as I loaded the last box. I turned to look at him, my husband of 7 years, soon-to-be ex-husband, soon-to-be multimillionaire. "No," I said. "This is exactly how you wanted things to go. You just didn't want them to feel this ugly." Then I drove away from the only home that had ever felt permanent, watching Marcus shrink in my rearview mirror until he disappeared entirely. My new apartment was a studio in a complex that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. One room for everything. Kitchen, bedroom, living room, all compressed into a space smaller than our old walk-in closet. But it was mine, paid for with money I'd earned, not inherited, not traded for. I spent the first night on an air mattress, staring at water stains on the ceiling and wondering how my life had compressed so completely. 7 years of shared everything reduced to boxes and a sleeping bag. But I didn't cry. Crying felt like giving Marcus permission to be right, like admitting this was the tragedy he'd tried to convince himself it wasn't. Instead, I started planning. Because here's what Marcus didn't know about his father's will. What he'd been too eager, too blinded by dollar signs to hear. I'd been listening when Hartwell mentioned those conditions, not just the divorce condition, all of them, and Marcus had been so focused on the marriage clause that he'd missed the others entirely. Richard Blackwood had been a bastard, but he'd been a careful bastard. A man who'd built his fortune by reading every contract, every clause, every piece of fine print. A man who didn't trust anyone, including his own son. The will had pages of conditions, requirements Marcus had to fulfill to keep that inheritance. And from what I'd heard in that lawyer's office, Marcus was about to discover that divorcing his wife was just the beginning of his father's demands. 3 days after I moved into my studio apartment, my phone rang at 6 a.m. Marcus's name on the screen. I almost didn't answer. Almost let it go to voicemail and saved myself whatever fresh humiliation he was calling to deliver. But something in the persistence of his calling made me pick up. "Laura." His voice was different, strained. The confident man who'd evicted me had been replaced by someone who sounded like he was drowning. "What do you want, Marcus?" "I need to ask you something, about the will, about what you heard that day." I sat up on my air mattress, suddenly very awake. "What about it?" "Did Hartwell say anything else? After the marriage condition?" I was so shocked about the divorce thing that I kind of zoned out for the rest. Here it was, the moment I'd been waiting for. "Why, is something wrong?" Silence on the other end. Then Marcus's voice, smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I think I might be in trouble." I could have helped him right then. Could have told him what I remembered, what I'd been smart enough to listen to while he was busy calculating his net worth. Could have saved him from whatever trap his father had laid. Instead, I said, "I don't remember much. I was pretty upset about being asked to dissolve my marriage for money." More silence. "Laura, please. I know I hurt you. I know this whole thing has been awful. But if you remember anything else Hartwell said, anything at all, I really need to know." "I'll think about it," I said, and hung up. Then I made myself coffee and sat by my single window, watching the sun rise over the parking lot of my new life, and smiled for the first time in weeks. Because Marcus was about to learn that his father's will wasn't just about money, it was about proving worthiness, about demonstrating the kind of ruthless business sense Richard had built his empire on. And Marcus was failing every test. The calls started coming daily after that. Marcus, increasingly desperate, trying different approaches. Sometimes apologetic, sometimes demanding, sometimes just confused. Each call revealed a little more about what he was facing. The inheritance wasn't just a lump sum. It was a business empire that required active management. Richard had structured it, so Marcus had to personally oversee major decisions for the first 6 months. Had to prove he could handle the responsibility. But Marcus had never worked in his father's business, had been deliberately kept out of it, treated as the spoiled son who'd never earned anything. Now he was supposed to run companies he didn't understand, make decisions about markets he'd never studied, manage employees who'd been running things just fine without him. From what I could gather through his increasingly frantic phone calls, he was drowning, making mistakes that were costing money, real money. The kind of mistakes that were eating into that $450 million like acid. The board wants to meet with me again tomorrow, he told me during one late-night call. I think they're planning to vote no confidence. That sounds stressful, I said, not offering any solutions. Laura, please. I know you're angry with me. I know I made terrible choices, but I'm begging you. If you remember anything else from that will reading, anything that might help me understand what my father wanted. I let him beg for a while, let him feel what desperation tasted like. Then I said, actually, I do remember something. The hope in his voice was almost pathetic. What? What do you remember? I remember Hartwell mentioning something about a secondary clause, something about what happens if you fail to meet the business requirements. Dead silence. What kind of business requirements? I don't remember exactly, but I think it had something to do with proving your competence, something about a timeline. I was feeding him just enough information to make him panic, but not enough to actually help. Did he say what happens if I fail? I paused, letting the tension build. I think the money goes away, all of it. The sound Marcus made wasn't quite a sob, but it was close. I need to call Hartwell, he said. I need to get the full will, read every word. That sounds like a good idea, I agreed. You probably should have done that a month ago. After I hung up, I opened my laptop and checked my bank account. My savings were dwindling faster than I'd hoped, and I needed to start looking for work soon. But watching Marcus's world collapse was worth the temporary financial stress. Because here's what I knew that Marcus didn't. What I'd learned from actually listening during the will reading instead of fantasizing about yacht purchases. Richard's will wasn't just about testing Marcus's business acumen. It was about testing his character, his loyalty, his ability to honor commitments and treat people with respect. There were performance metrics built into every clause, not just financial performance, but ethical performance. How he treated employees, how he handled negotiations, whether he honored existing contracts and commitments. Marcus had been failing these tests from day one, starting with how he treated me. But the most beautiful part, the part that had made me smile in that lawyer's office while my marriage was being dissolving around me, was the clause Hartwell had mentioned at the very end. The clause about restoration. If Marcus failed to meet the will's requirements, the inheritance would be redistributed. Not to charity, as the primary clause stated, but according to a secondary distribution schedule that Richard had kept sealed until such failure occurred. I knew this because I'd been paying attention, because I'd heard Hartwell mention it in passing, assuming everyone in the room was as focused as I was. Marcus had 6 months to prove himself worthiest of Richard's legacy. 6 months to run the business successfully while demonstrating the character traits Richard valued most. He was 3 months in and failing spectacularly. The next call came at midnight. I was already asleep on my air mattress when my phone buzzed. Marcus again, of course. This time he sounded like he'd been drinking. I read the whole will, he said without preamble, every goddamn word. I sat up, suddenly alert. And? You were right about the business requirements, but it's worse than I thought, much worse. He told me about the performance metrics, the character assessments, the way every decision he made was being evaluated not just for profitability, but for ethical standards. I'm failing, Laura. I'm failing everything. There was something broken in his voice, something that might have been regret if I was feeling generous. The board is planning a vote of no confidence next week. If they succeed, I lose operational control. and according to the will, losing operational control means I forfeit the entire inheritance. That sounds complicated, I said, my voice carefully neutral. There's something else, something I need to tell you. Here it comes, I thought. The real reason for the midnight call. The will has clauses about personal relationships, about how I treat people close to me, how I honor commitments and vows. I said nothing. Let him work up to it himself. The divorce counts against me, Laura. Dad structured it so that breaking marriage vows is considered a character failure, a disqualifying failure. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. Richard Blackwood had structured his will to punish his son for the very thing he demanded his son do to claim the inheritance. It was the kind of impossible puzzle a cruel, brilliant man might design to prove his son was unworthy of his legacy. So what are you saying? I asked, though I already knew. I need you to help me. I need us to get remarried, before the 6-month deadline. It's the only way I can prove to the board and the will's executors that I'm capable of honoring commitments. There it was, the desperation I'd been waiting for. You want to remarry me to save your inheritance. I want to remarry you because I made a terrible mistake, because I let money cloud my judgment and I threw away the best thing in my life. His words sounded practiced, rehearsed, like he'd been working up to this speech for days. And if the inheritance wasn't at stake, would you still want me back? Long pause. I don't know, he admitted. I honestly don't know anymore. This whole thing has messed me up so badly I'm not sure what I want versus what I need. At least he was being honest now, that was something. I need time to think, I told him. How much time? Because the deadline is in 10 weeks. I'll let you know, I said, and hung up. Then I lay in the darkness of my studio apartment, listening to traffic outside my window, and planned my next move. Because Marcus still didn't know about the secondary distribution clause, still didn't understand that his failure wouldn't just mean losing the money, it would mean watching it go somewhere else entirely. And I was starting to get a pretty good idea of where that somewhere else might be. The next morning, I called Thomas Hartwell's office and made an appointment. As Richard's daughter-in-law, I was entitled to certain information about the will's structure. Certain clarifications about how the various clauses interacted. Hartwell was a thin man with silver hair and the kind of steady gaze that came from delivering bad news professionally for decades. His office smelled like leather and old secrets. Mrs. Blackwood, he said, gesturing to a chair across from his massive desk, I suspected I might be hearing from you. I need to understand something about Richard's will, about the secondary distribution clause. Hartwell's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. That's a very specific clause to ask about. I was listening more carefully than my husband during the reading. Yes, Hartwell said slowly, I noticed that. He opened a file cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. Richard's complete will, I assumed. The version with all the conditions and subclauses and carefully crafted traps. The secondary distribution clause is activated if Marcus fails to meet the primary inheritance requirements. Hartwell explained, opening the folder to a specific page. In such cases, the estate is distributed according to Richard's predetermined secondary beneficiaries. Who are those beneficiaries? Hartwell looked at me for a long moment, like he was deciding how much to reveal. The primary secondary beneficiary is you, Mrs. Blackwood. The words hit me like cold water. Me? Richard was very specific about this. In the event that Marcus proves unworthy of the inheritance through character failures or business incompetence, the bulk of the estate transfers to his daughter-in-law, with certain trusts established for potential future grandchildren. I stared at Hartwell, trying to process what he was telling me. Richard believed, Hartwell continued, that you possessed the character and judgment his son lacked. He'd been watching your marriage for years, observing how you handled difficulties, how you treated others, how you supported Marcus through various challenges. But why didn't he just leave me the money in the first place? Because he wanted to give Marcus a chance to prove himself, but he also wanted to ensure that if Marcus failed that test, the money would go to someone worthy. Someone who understood the value of commitment and loyalty. The room felt like it was tilting. How much of the estate? 80%. Marcus would retain 20% as a trust fund, enough to live comfortably but not enough to wield serious financial power. $450 million. 80% of that was $360 million. I sat in that leather chair, staring at Richard's will, understanding finally what the old bastard had been planning all along. He'd designed a test that Marcus couldn't pass, had created conditions that forced his son to choose between love and money, then structured the consequences to punish him for choosing wrong. But he'd also been testing me, watching to see how I'd handle betrayal, whether I'd seek revenge or rise above it, whether I'd prove worthy of the fortune his son was about to lose. "There's one more thing you should know," Hartwell said, his voice carefully neutral. "The secondary distribution clause activates automatically upon Marcus's failure to meet the primary requirements. However, there is a provision for you to waive your inheritance if you choose to remarry Marcus before the deadline. Meaning if you remarry Marcus to help him keep the inheritance, you forfeit your claim to the secondary distribution. You're essentially choosing his inheritance over your own." The final test, the ultimate choice between love and money, just flipped around. If I helped Marcus by remarrying him, I'd lose everything but save his inheritance. If I refused to help him, I'd become one of the wealthiest women in the country while he lost almost everything. Richard Blackwood had been a magnificent bastard. I thanked Hartwell and left his office with my head spinning, walked through downtown in a daze, trying to understand the scope of what I'd learned. Marcus had thrown me away for money he was going to lose anyway. I had spent weeks in a studio apartment, eating ramen and watching my savings dwindle, while sitting unknowingly on a fortune that dwarfed Marcus's inheritance. The old man had been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. That evening, Marcus called again. His voice was getting more desperate with each conversation. "Have you decided about remarrying?" I looked around my tiny apartment, at the air mattress and the instant coffee and the single window that looked out on a parking lot. "I'm still thinking." "Laura, please. I know I've been awful. I know I hurt you in ways I can't take back. But we could build something good together with this inheritance. We could travel, have kids, never worry about money again." What Marcus didn't understand was that I was already going to have all those things. The question was whether I'd have them with him or in spite of him. "What would make you think I'd want to remarry someone who divorced me for money?" "Because deep down, you know I love you. I made a terrible mistake, but we can fix this, together." "Did you love me when you served me divorce papers?" Silence. "Did you love me when you evicted me from our home?" Laura. "Did you love me when you reduced our marriage to a business arrangement?" I was confused, I was grieving and overwhelmed, and I made terrible choices. "No," I said. "You made revealing choices. You showed me exactly who you are when money is involved. People change. I've changed. Going through this inheritance nightmare has taught me what really matters." "Has it? Or have you just learned what you need to say to get what you want?" The truth was, I still loved Marcus. Loved the man he'd been before his father's death and the inheritance offer. Loved the man who'd held me through my mother's cancer treatments and who'd cried with me after our miscarriage. But I also knew now that the man I'd loved wasn't strong enough to withstand temptation, wasn't solid enough to weather the storms that real wealth and power would bring. Richard had known this about his son, had structured his will to prove it. "I need more time," I told Marcus. "We don't have more time. The deadline is 8 weeks away." "Then you'd better hope I decide quickly." After I hung up, I made another appointment with Hartwell. I needed to understand every aspect of what I was facing, every condition, every requirement, every possible outcome. Because if I was going to make this choice, I was going to make it with complete information. Unlike Marcus, I was going to read every word of the fine print before I signed my life away. The second meeting with Hartwell was different, more detailed. He walked me through every aspect of the secondary distribution, every requirement I'd need to meet to claim the inheritance. The requirements were minimal compared to what Marcus was facing. I'd need to demonstrate basic financial competency, agree to maintain certain charitable commitments Richard had established, and pass a character assessment from the will's executors. "The character assessment is largely a formality in your case," Hartwell explained. Richard documented his observations about your character quite extensively. He was impressed by how you handled your mother's illness, how you supported Marcus through various difficulties, how you conducted yourself during social and business functions. He was watching me? Richard watched everyone in his family's orbit. It's how he built his fortune and protected his interests. He believed character was the most reliable predictor of future success. And what did he conclude about my character? Hartwell opened another file and consulted what looked like several pages of handwritten notes. Loyal, but not blindly so. Intelligent enough to see through people's motivations, but compassionate enough to forgive their weaknesses. Strong enough to handle betrayal without becoming vindictive. Practical enough to make difficult decisions, but principled enough to make ethical ones. It was strange, hearing myself described through a dead man's eyes. Strange, and oddly validating. He also noted, Hartwell continued, that you understood the difference between being wealthy and being rich, between having money and being owned by it. What's the difference? Wealthy people use money as a tool, rich people become tools of their money. I understood. Marcus had become a tool of money he didn't even have yet, had let the possibility of wealth reshape his entire moral framework. There's something else you should know, Hartwell said, closing the file. If you claim the secondary inheritance, you'll inherit not just Richard's wealth, but his business empire. You'll become the controlling shareholder in companies that employ thousands of people. You'll have real power, not just money. The weight of that responsibility settled on me like a heavy coat. Richard believed you were capable of handling that power responsibly, but he also understood it would change your life completely. There would be no going back to simplicity. I thought about my studio apartment, my air mattress, my instant coffee, about the simple life I'd been building for myself after Marcus destroyed our marriage. Taking Richard's inheritance would mean giving up that simplicity forever, would mean becoming someone I'd never planned to be. But it would also mean having the resources to help people, to make the kind of changes I'd only dreamed about when Marcus and I used to talk about what we'd do if we ever had real money. How long do I have to decide? The secondary distribution activates automatically when Marcus's deadline expires. If you want to claim it, you simply need to be present at that moment and not married to Marcus. And if I'm married to Marcus? Then you forfeit your claim and the money goes to the tertiary beneficiaries, various charities mostly. The final pieces of Richard's chess game revealed themselves. He'd created a situation where either his son learned to value character over money or a person of proven character inherited his fortune. Either way, the money would end up in hands he deemed worthy. I thanked Hartwell and left his office with 6 weeks to make the most important decision of my life. That night, I walked through downtown, looking at the city with new eyes. Seeing the problems that money could solve, the opportunities that wealth could create, the responsibility that would come with Richard's legacy. I also thought about Marcus, alone in our old house, probably pacing the same bedroom where he decided I was worth less than his inheritance. My phone buzzed, another text from him. Please call me. I have something important to tell you. I ignored it and kept walking. 2 days later, Marcus showed up at my apartment building. I found him in the lobby, looking haggard and desperate, wearing clothes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. You won't answer my calls, he said. No, I won't. I need to tell you something. About the will. About what I've learned. I crossed my arms and waited. Dad didn't just structure the will to test my business skills, he structured it to test my character, and I'm failing every test. That's unfortunate. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd seen 1,000 times when he was frustrated. I know about the secondary distribution now. I know what happens to the money if I fail. My expression didn't change, but my pulse quickened. What about it? Hartwell told me, yesterday. When I went in to discuss extending the deadline, Marcus laughed bitterly. Turns out there are no extensions in a dead man's will. Marcus. He told me the money goes to you. That Dad structured everything so you'd inherit if I proved unworthy. We stood in that sterile lobby, 7 months of marriage and betrayal and twisted love hanging between us like smoke. And what do you think about that? I asked. I think Dad was smarter than either of us realized. I think he knew exactly who I was and exactly who you were, and he structured his will accordingly. Marcus stepped closer, and I could smell the exhaustion on him. I also think I've been the biggest fool who ever lived. Because you're losing the money. Because I threw you away for money that was never really mine to begin with. Because I failed every test that mattered. Because I proved my father right about me. There was something different in Marcus's voice now. Something that sounded like genuine remorse rather than desperate manipulation. What are you saying? I'm saying you should take the inheritance. You deserve it more than I do. You'd use it better than I ever would. I stared at him, surprised by this turn. But I'm also saying that if there's any chance, any possibility that you might consider forgiving me, I want to try to earn that. Not for the money, not for the inheritance, for us. Marcus. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I made choices that revealed the worst parts of who I am, but these past months have taught me something about myself that I didn't want to learn. He paused, struggling with words. I'm not strong enough for the kind of wealth and power Dad built. I'm not disciplined enough, or smart enough, or ruthless enough. But maybe I'm strong enough to be a better husband. Maybe I'm smart enough to appreciate what I had before I threw it away. I looked at this man I'd loved for 7 years. This man who'd betrayed me and evicted me and reduced our marriage to a business arrangement. This man who was now offering to sacrifice his inheritance for the chance to rebuild what he'd destroyed. Are you asking me to remarry you knowing it means I'll forfeit the secondary inheritance? I'm asking you to consider whether we might build something together that's worth more than any amount of money. The irony was perfect. Marcus was finally learning the lesson his father had tried to teach him, but only after it was too late to pass the test. I need time to think, I said. How much time? 5 weeks, until the deadline. Marcus nodded, accepting this. Laura, whatever you decide, I want you to know something. These months without you have been hell. Not because of the money stress, not because of the business failures. Because I lost the person who made everything else make sense. He turned to leave, then stopped. And, if you decide to take the inheritance instead of remarrying me, I'll understand. It's what you deserve, it's justice. After he left, I sat in my studio apartment as the sun set over the parking lot, thinking about justice and forgiveness, and the difference between the two. 3 weeks before the deadline, I made my decision. I called Marcus and asked him to meet me at the coffee shop where we'd had our first date 8 years ago. Neutral ground for a conversation that would determine both of our futures. He arrived early, I noticed as I walked in. Was already sitting at a corner table with coffee growing cold in front of him, watching the door like his life depended on who walked through it. Maybe it did. Thank you for coming, he said as I sat down. I have something to tell you. Marcus tensed, preparing himself for whatever verdict I'd reached. I've spent the last 5 weeks thinking about who you are versus who I need you to be, about who I am versus who I want to become. I paused, watching his face. I've also been thinking about your father and what he was really testing with his will. What do you mean? Richard wasn't just testing whether you could run his businesses or make smart financial decisions. He was testing whether you understood that relationships are more valuable than money. Whether you'd learned that some things can't be bought or sold. Marcus nodded, waiting. But he was also testing me. Testing whether I'd choose love or money when presented with the same impossible choice you faced. And what did you decide? I looked at this man who'd hurt me so deeply, who'd shown me the worst parts of his character, who was now offering to sacrifice everything for the chance to rebuild what we'd had. I decided that your father was wrong about something fundamental. Marcus frowned, confused. He structured his will like a zero-sum game, like someone had to lose for someone else to win, like character was about choosing between competing values rather than finding ways to honor multiple values. I don't understand. I'm not going to remarry you to save your inheritance, I said. Marcus's face fell. But I'm also not going to claim the secondary inheritance for myself. Now he looked completely baffled. I've been meeting with Hartwell for weeks, exploring every option in your father's will, reading every clause and subclause and condition. I leaned forward, watching Marcus's expression change as he started to understand. There's a tertiary option your father built into the will. a clause that activates if the primary beneficiary fails the test, but the secondary beneficiary chooses to waive their claim for ethical reasons rather than personal gain. What kind of tertiary option? A charitable foundation, controlled jointly by both of us, funded with the full inheritance, dedicated to the causes your father cared about, but with the flexibility to address problems he never imagined. Marcus stared at me. You want to give away $450 million? I want to use $450 million to build something meaningful, together, as partners who've learned what really matters. But we'd be giving up the money. No, I said, we'd be putting the money to work in ways that would make us wealthy in every sense that matters. I pulled out the legal documents I'd been working on with Hartwell for weeks. The foundation would pay us reasonable salaries, enough to live well but not enough to become the kind of people who measure worth in dollars. We'd have purpose, resources to help others, and the satisfaction of building something together. Marcus looked through the papers with growing amazement. This would mean starting over, building a new kind of life together. Yes. And you think we can do that? After everything that's happened? I thought about the man Marcus had been before his father's death, about the couple we'd been when we were struggling financially but supporting each other emotionally, about the people we might become if we chose purpose over profit. I think we can try, if you're willing to prove you've learned what your father was trying to teach us both. Marcus set down the papers and looked at me with something I hadn't seen in his eyes for months. Hope. What would I need to prove? That you choose us over money, that you choose purpose over power, that you choose building something meaningful over inheriting something you didn't earn. And if I prove those things, then we start over, not as the people we were, but as the people we've learned to become. Marcus reached across the table and took my hand, not possessively, not desperately, but gently, like he was handling something precious that he'd learned not to take for granted. I don't deserve this chance, he said. No, I agreed. You don't. But maybe that's exactly why you need it. 2 weeks later, we stood in Thomas Hartwell's office as the deadline expired. Marcus formally relinquished his claim to the primary inheritance. I waived my rights to the secondary distribution. Together, we signed the documents establishing the Blackwood Foundation, dedicated to education, healthcare, and financial literacy programs. Richard's $450 million would now fund scholarships instead of yachts, would build hospitals instead of mansions, would teach financial responsibility instead of enabling financial recklessness. As we left Hartwell's office, Marcus stopped on the sidewalk and looked back at the building where his father's final lesson had been delivered. Do you think he knew? Marcus asked. Do you think Dad knew we'd choose this option? I thought about Richard Blackwood, the brilliant, manipulative man who'd orchestrated this entire elaborate test from beyond the grave. I think he hoped we would. I think this was always the outcome he wanted most. Even though it means I failed his test? No, I said. I think this means you finally passed it. 6 months later, we were remarried in a small ceremony funded by our foundation salaries. The guest list was small, the flowers were simple, the reception was held in a community center we'd helped renovate. It was perfect. Marcus wore a suit he'd owned for years instead of buying something new. I wore a dress I'd found at a thrift store, beautiful because of the joy it represented rather than its price tag. We honeymooned by visiting the first scholarship recipients our foundation had funded, meeting kids who would go to college because Richard Blackwood's money had been put to work changing lives instead of padding bank accounts. As we drove home from that trip, Marcus reached over and took my hand. Do you ever regret it? He asked. Giving up the money? I looked out at the landscape rolling past our modest rental car, thinking about the life we were building together, about the foundation that was already changing lives. About the marriage we were rebuilding on a foundation of shared values rather than shared financial goals. Never, I said, not for a second. And I meant it. Because Marcus and I had learned something his father had been trying to teach us from the beginning. We'd learned the difference between being rich and being wealthy, between having money and having a life worth living. We'd learned that the most valuable inheritance isn't what you receive, but what you choose to build with what you've been given. And we'd learned that sometimes the greatest fortune comes from walking away from a fortune. Richard Blackwood's final lesson had been learned. Not the way he'd originally planned, perhaps, but in the way that mattered most. His son had finally proven worthy of his legacy by choosing to give it away.